Yeah. You do the...
Kaurua o ki reira, i ai rā ko te hu, me te hari ki tai, hei mā take mā, te kanohi tangata, hei mā take mā te moana, wai, hei mā take mā, te ngaru kō pūmate, mā te ngaru paimate mā te ngaru, hori i te moana, hei mā take mā te tini o tangaroa he hai. Tēnei te tuku atu rā, kupurau ko kōrero ki o tātou nei pare kawa iriaki ki rungi i tō tātou nei maunga i tēnei wā. Aha ko te kahawiti mai o tamanui te rā ki rungi a tātou, ka rongo tonu tātou, ana hei te pōuriuri, te pōtangotango, ka pā mai rā i te ngāka o te tangata. Koutou rā, kua riro atu rā ki tua, koutou rā ngā peka are te pō haere na rungi i te whakaaro mātua, te aroha o mātou, e kori mai nei, i runga i te mato o te whenua. E moi koutou rā, te moi, au ai te moi, e ratau. Hoki tōra tika mai rā ki tātou e kawe ake rā, ngā kaupapa ngā hui ngā a mātua nei, kia piki te kaha te ora, te manamatanga ki rungi a tātou i tēnei wā. Wai wakaru anō ki te ronga ngāngara kai tangata uru tā kua pā mai rā i tēnei wā. Te rapea ko tohu mātua nei, kia whai oranga tātou, kia tiakina tātou i a tātou anō, nā rungi ngā tohu, o ngā mātua tupuna anō hoki. Nā i ta mea i ngā wā omoa ko pērā tonu, te toimahatanga kua tau mai rā ki rungi a tātou. Nā e mehi ka wake rā anō hoki tēnei ki koutou ngā kai mā taki me ngā kaupapa huri rauna i tō tātou nei maunga, e tūkara te mai ana i te ao i te pō, o tātou nei iwi o Taranaki iwi, ana i ngā rangitata nei kua pai ngā wera ki rungi i te takutai, koutou, mea koutou ki te tiaki i te taia o tēnei te mihi ka wake rā, ta tūru mai rā ki ngā iwi o tō tātou nei maunga, e tiakina i a tātou i te wā o te karauna. Nori rā, e mihi ka wake rā ki koutou, o koutou kaha, nā ki te mā taki tēnei wāanga i tūranga kōrero, o kā tūranga wakaputa atu rā i tehi o ngā kōrero, hei kai timo mai i tehi, hei hākari mai i tehi atu anō. Nori rā, nau mai, hara mai, whakatau mai rā. Kua hoki mai rā, tō tātou nei pai, tō tātou nei ana tōtara hoi, nā ai te rapea ai witi, ai wā aere i ngā kōrero o ngā mātua, te manako nuia, ka wai maramatanga e roto i e tihi o ngā kōrero. Nau mai, hara mai, whakatau mai rā. Ana, kua tatu mai rā, ana Jamie, moi, Hemi, ko te poihi tēnei, mihi ka wake anō ki tātou, te arabai ka tuka atu rā, tēnei o ngā rākau kōrero ki tēnā, hei waka taki kōrero, i mua tō tātou nei kōrero, kaupapa kōrero i hari aki nei. Nō reira, nau mai, hara mai, whakatau mai rā. Tēnā koe, Jamie.
Tēnā rā tātou, tēnā rā koe te poihi. Hoi te anō rā, tairanga mai te motu, tairanga mai te ao, manawa ikitea mai, manawa apāinga mai, kia piri mai, kia tata mai rā koutou. Ki tō tātou pai kōrero, tēnei taonga o tātou te korimako, tēnei manu kōrero, ana e kōkō nei, kia koutou, e te motu, e te ao, nō reira, tēnā rā koutou, tēnā rā tātou me ho tātou mate, o te waiti nei, nō reira, ka nui rā te mi i kia tātou.
Kia ora tātou, te whai te ia o ngā mi i kia koutou, wakaronga mai ana, tēnei te Kohu Ka Rewa ka mi i kia koutou. Nau mai ki tō tātou pāpai kōrero i te pōnei, ngā mi i ki ngā mate e tautoko ake ana, ngā mi i ki ngā tupua i pai ki uta, i te takutai ki Taranaki, mihi ana ki tērā kaupapa. Ue no, ko tō tātou kaupapa i te pōnei, kia rewa i te kohu, kia tūpono ki te atu ai pēr he mara kōrero hei tātari mā koutou, o te anō e tātari mā tātou i te pōnei. Hoi no mi iana kia koutou e aku tuakana, ko e ke mai, o te anō nui ngā kōrero, hoi no kia haere ngā mii, kia haere ngā mate, kia haere anō te kaupapa kai wainga nui a tātou. Kia ora e moi.
Tēnā tātou kei te ki tātu pē ko te kohu kua rewa mai ki runga ki taku whakaata kāri te tino ki te atu. Ewe anō, kei te mihi atu ki te reo, nā no tātou i ara i ki tēnei waanga o te pō. Tēnei anō rā me ki, te waanga o tō tātou nei maunga, mihi atu ana kia tātou. Kei te iwi uri noa, I te waitua, tō tātou roe, me ki Taranaki nui tonu uri te titiro, ki roto i a ngā rauru wanganui, puta atu ki Aotearoa, ki te kawatainga o tēnei o ngā ika, o tino huri atu ki tōna nei, ki te waka a Māui. Tēnei a moi, nā, ko o ki mai anō, I runga I te kaupapa nāna no tātou I hiake me ki rā te whatumanoa ki te wānanga, ki te titiro, ki te kōrero atu, ki te kōrero mai. E te iwi, tēnei mihi atu ana tēnā koutou.
Tēnā koutou. Well, welcome back to Te Kohu Ka Rewa, te hanga nei, hahua pura he pōhehe, he pura oku karu I au, e mātaki ia mo I tēnei pō. But that's okay, it's a technical issue here. Yeah, and so if anybody knows how to fix this problem, please send us a message and direct it to Mo'i Apo. So just acknowledgement to Taranaki iwi for their kaupapa that we've seen the pilot whales beach themselves over the last couple of days. So the process of looking after them and managing that kaupapa, it's a big one. And once again, we're looking after the taiao, and also a big shout out also to all of our iwi who are looking after the iwi around Taranaki maunga in regards to the COVID situation at this time. And so I hope that this just brings a little bit of light entertainment and some learnings along the way. So that's the objective for tonight. So welcome back to Te Kohu Ka Rewa. Hoi anō rā, I think we'll go to our first slide. Anei tētihi o ngā karakia tanga kōrero. Te ara pēr ka tuku atu rā te mauri kōrero, te rākau kōrero kia Jamie. Mana anō oki e waka mārama atu ana ki tātou. Ngā waka mārama o tēnā rerenga kōrero, o tēnā rerenga kōrero. Tēnā koe Jamie.
O tēnā tātou. He wahanga tēnei o tētahi karakia. E kia nei ko te karakia maungārongo. He karakia tauito tēnei, hoi te anō rā ko te karakia tēnei taki-takina, e te tupuna nei a hapurona. Te tupuna nei a hapurona I te wā I mau ai te rongo I wāinga nui I aia me tana iwi, me te kāwanatanga ki Waitara, I te tau ko tahi mano e warurau, ono te kaumātahi te tau. So this is another example of a karakia, which is an ancient karakia but has been used throughout multiple generations, but it is prominent because of the fact that it was a karakia that was delivered during the peacemaking between hapurona, hapurona being one of the lieutenants, if you like, of Wiremu very involved in the Waitara War. And when peace was made between he and his people and the government in 1861. And so this is the sort of second stanza of that particular karakia, but I think it's in keeping with a lot of the themes and discussions that we've had over the past 12 weeks. And pupu wa manawa o tama waka ia manawa o tama ki te rangi. Rangi nui, rangi roa, rangi tāua. Tāua anuku tāua rangi e tu e o mai tō wairua ora he ora. Awi o ki te papatuatai, awi o ki te papatuarua. Pupuru rā, raru rā ki tā more nui. No papa, e rongo e ai o tēnā tauito pau kātū. E tauito. Ko tauito I wea, ko tauito I tua, ko tauito I a rangi nui e tū nei. And so it's beautiful because the imagery here, pupu wa manawa o tama. So we've spoken in previous weeks about this concept of manawa. And manawa not only being the heart, but manawa also being the breath that we draw, which of course is symbolic of this thing called life. And so pupu wa manawa o tama. It's beautiful because it's saying the life drawing breath, the life gasping breath of humankind. So koira te mahi a te tangata, he pupu wa manawa. So it's that image, that's how we draw breath. Waka ia manawa o tama ki te rangi. And it's saying, that we can draw, we're drawing upon breath again, sort of upwards. And we've spoken in previous weeks about the role and the symbol and the role and what ranginui symbolizes. And we've talked about, that those material aspects of papatuanuku, but we've also talked about ranginui in terms of providing life and well-being. And here is an example of that, because when we think about when we draw breath, the references o tama ki te rangi, rangi nui, rangi rua, rangi taua. Tahua anuku, tahua rangi e tu e. So we actually spoke about this concept of tahua anuku, tahua rangi. So talking about those, it's talking about, I guess, sort of intellectual capacity in some respects. So the vastness of those material, those intellectual things that we have, both sort of tangible and intangible, and then calling upon homai tō wairua ora, he ora. So that theme again throughout our karakia in terms of calling upon these higher deities to provide us with the strength, with the life force, with the determination, with the resilience, with those things that will enable us to survive and prosper. So he whakaro anō ha koutou?
Have I got my mic on?
Yep. Aye.
I was just thinking of the ia koe kōrero ana wai we were talking, Jamie. So also I like the reference when we goes to tama and another understanding. I see tama as I think you said humankind. So the tama, that I've seen that in a few other narratives, other karakia, where it makes reference to tama in the sense of drawing on both the female and male element, as in tamatane and tamawaine. So in that instance, it's talking about the humankind. So whakaia ia manawa ki te o tama ki te rangi. So I guess that's that you could see it as a dual or a single way of looking at it. So it could be the individual who's a representative of the human and the male and female element, but also it could be a dual understanding as well as for the multitude. In the essence that the tama in itself just doesn't just represent that himself or herself, but also those generations that he or she descends from. Again, it's going back to the genesis of life, and it just drawing back to where the absolute font of life or beginning, or the kopaunga. I think we used that word last week. The font of our mortality, so to speak. So when we make reference to our rangi nui, rangi rua, I guess again I see the celestial law, talking L-O-R-E, and the terrestrial law coming into being here, tā hua nuku, tā hua rangi, and exactly to your point, Jamie. So I've not heard the narrative until now, but it sort of makes sense to how I understood it and how I've been giving that narrative, and when I've used it myself, and then the understanding. So it sort of marries up to what I'm saying. So I like how I can actually attach it now to a paiaka, which you provided for us tonight, Jamie, so far. Ngā mihi.
Yeah, a little segue into that, just as you talk about paiaka. Mohi, I've seen this karakia in about 4 different places that also use the reference pupu wa manawa o tāne. Whakaia manawa o tāne ki te rangi. So for me, it does describe that life cycle, which we can liken to the growth of a person, yeah. in a way in which the tree takes root, a way in which the tree grows and breathes and provides towards the sky and provides oxygen, provides life. And so further down through that, we can see te pupuru rā, raru rā, ki tā more nui no rangi. For me, talks about the growth of tāne and how that tāne provides a pillar of, we've spoken about pou and the symbology and the similarities through the growth of seed and root systems and how that grows towards the sky and how that likens that symbol, I suppose, or concept is likened to us in humankind, yeah. So I see that I've seen it in other places referenced as tāne, and when it is referenced as tāne, there's a very strong symbol towards the te rākau, te tupunga o te rākau ki te rangi nui, rangi roa, rangi tahua, and ka tahua nuku, ka tahua rangi, ka homai te wairua ora i te hanga pupu a tanga mai o te hau, hei ora mo te tangata. Ana ka tupu mai te rākau hei pou ki te unua. And interestingly, this karakia pūpūwa is referenced as one of Tohu's set of poi too, Jamie, which you recall, as one of poi's kind of Tohu's tino poi. So it's been so we have this a verse of it in karakia form tonight, but it's also presented as a poi.
Yeah.
Mo te maungarongo, hea te tohu o te maungarongo he rākau.
Well, two things I see here, Hemi, o tino e tātou mātou. So I've seen another version of this, but it's in the Kere Meneta's scriptures. Slightly different, but the intent is still in there. So in that, when I first saw that, I sort of liken this. So how people, we know in our narratives about tāne mahuta separating the earth and the sky, but for myself, I've always maintained that it actually happened, and we're looking at some of the narratives here, which are actually reference points. They actually talk about the validation points of that actually happening. And when I say that, I'm talking about, you mentioned oxygen, which is given off from tāne mahuta as a real, if we come back to a simple understanding, which, from all plant life, flora and fauna, that type of understanding, which gives off that type of thing, which creates the ozone layer, which actually enforces the ozone layer. So in a sense, that is tāne separating the earth and the sky. So, and that's how I always maintain that narrative and that understanding. So, because it's all in there, the validation that are in those karakia.
Mohi te kōrero a tau pārai. Gravity and hiatana kōrero I roto I te reo mo te gravity.
Au kume, au tō?
That's rangi tuku.
Yeah.
And piki mai rawea.
Yeah, rangi
so
tuku. Yeah.
That's the narrative around Maui, and I'll use fishing up the North Island. So the quick, and we all know that story, but the narrative that we understand it to be was the Te rangi tuku was the line, which was actually the gravitational forces of the marama. And Piki Mai Rawea was the gravitational force, which was the hook, the name of the hook, which came from Muriranga Whenua. And then Te rangi tuku was that the energy source, or the gravitational pull, which was created by the marama, and that was his way of explaining that that narrative. That's the one you're talking about, James?
Yeah. Ko kōrero tia e mātau te kōrero mo te hi ngāke o te ikaroa. Me ngā kōrero ake o Taranaki me ona rerekētanga ki etahi atu iwi o te motu. But yeah, I mean, it's that whole concept, right, of our tupuna's understanding of the environment and how it all fits together.
Well, I tend to think that in my very limited understanding of te ao kohatu, some of these narratives, yes, they're like this, as reference points, validation, or whatever historical way of recording history. Sorry, a way of recording history, but also a way to make it palatable for our children to feed that type of kōrero or narrative as a pūrākau or pakimairo. But at the same time, also, you know, there's a challenge there of making sure they understand the intent of what's inside their kōrero and the narrative.
Yeah, ko taku kite, ko te rākau he tangata, ko te tangata whakarite ana ki te rākau, ko rāua. Ka noho rā ki roto ki te wairua o tēnei karakia.
Yes.
Yeah, ka pai. So, awi o ki te papa tuatahi, awi o ki te papa tuarua. And interestingly, a lot of our Taranaki waiata and karakia, you know, pērei te tangi mo Māui pomare, you know, piki atu koe ki te rangi tuatahi ki te rangi tuarua, papa tuatahi, papa tuarua. You know, sort of, it's those levels of. So what it's saying is, sort of, yeah,
Tupunga.
Yeah, tupunga, right? So in terms of that development and that evolution, and how we embrace that, you know, ka eke ki taumata no, and sort of, but what it also reminds us of is this sort of that continuity. You know, the fact that this growth, this development is never ending.
Yes.
And then, you know, pupuru rā, raru rā he rongo, he ai, raru rā ki tā more nui no papa. And we've talked about, you know, tā more nui no papa, but, you know, how we embrace these things, how we take firm hold of those things that enable us to grow, to develop, to prosper. And that how it is grounded in the place which we connect to. You know, that we draw our identity and our sustenance from, you know, our tūranga waiwai, our taiao. And again, so we've got ki tā more nui no papa, he rongo he aio. And we've talked previously about the fact that, you know, by having a strong foundation, that being, you know, having that strong identity gives us a sense of inner peace and tranquility. Yeah, but it really, you know, when you have that understanding, that maramatanga, you know, you're a whole person, and when you're a whole person, you are confident and at ease, you know, and comfortable. And I think that's a beautiful way of thinking, you know, that if you have tēnei mea te aiotanga, then you are quite comfortable in not knowing stuff. And I think, you know, that is probably one of the biggest challenges that we have as human beings, right? Is that often we find it hard to say we don't know, but actually saying we don't know is actually a quality and a strength.
Paitera.
Yeah.
Paitera. Yeah, you know, I think, you know, with this, you know, this is an ancient karakia. But, you know, so there are nuances of it described in other ways. So the best way I can, in another way, would be tangata akuna ki te kāinga tū ki te marae tauana. That's about, you know, finding your, and I'll paraphrase here, finding your roots or grounding yourself. So couldn't help it.
Next slide.
Yeah. But here whānau, you know, so we've gone through paua ki runga, paua ki raro, paua ki tā more. Again, you know, as we've discussed in previous weeks, this is yet another example of that worldview and that framework that was applied by our tupuna. And again, when you think about the context of this karakia being one of maunga of cementing peace, you know, again, he rongo he ai o tēnā tawhito pau kā tū, he tawhito, ko tawhito i wea, ko tawhito i tua, ko tawhito i a ranginui e tūnei. So, And then it goes on. So it's about that. In order to maintain peace, you need to have that commitment, that dedication.
And understanding.
So the tawhito, sort of that's an inference around that? Or that's the intention around that?
Yeah, well, I mean, yeah. Sorry, him.
I did no tua, ancient, yeah.
Ancient, yeah. So so what this is reminding us of is, these schools of knowledge, this understanding, this wisdom, these ancient ways of being and knowing. Ko tawhito I arangi nui e tūnei, this very knowledge which has come from ranginui, which is really that understanding of our natural world, right?
Yeah.
And if you're at one with your natural world, because you know and you feel and you sense and you know.
I'll probably see the the ancient teachings, so the tawhito kura, the tawhito, probably the ancient teachings. Do not forget that. Just be reminded. I think it's a reminder for ourselves that actually our teachings are within the elements and the narratives that we have. The po being the pillar of those ancient teachings, and that we can acquire these teachings when we're reminded by our narratives. I just look at this also. There are key phrases for me that I look at. Obviously, the duality is one thing, nuku and rangi, but even just the phrase "homai tō wairua ora he ora he tono anō hoki tērā kia wake eki homai rā te hā o te ora ki ngi te tangata." So I just sort of see that like that. And obviously, we have spoken about grounding ourselves, tā mori mori nui no papa, and about there is a reminder, and it's in our probably living memory, or I think there's something to do with memory in here as well, from the ancient teachings, that so there's two things, there's intellect and intelligence. I think they're talking about the intelligence, the DNA that we have, being whakapapa based people, we internally, intrinsically have this knowledge. We just need to observe it and express it in today's context.
I noted, and this is not pinpricking, I just noted that you said tono. Are we saying that? Is this a tono? That's not pinpricking.
He karanga.
Yeah.
He karanga maybe is a better word.
I just say I think it's nice to highlight some of these things, not so much for us, but as food for thought for those ones who are listening in.
Yeah. Kapoi. Well, I think kapoi. I think we will move to our next slide there, please. Mata Pipe. Now, you may need your glasses for this one because, Over to you, Hemi, or Jamie.
Yeah. Oh, no, ma Hemi. Kōrero tia te horopaki hem in this, and then I think we can, the next one has sort of a summarized version, so.
Okay.
Oh, geez, yeah, I think we started last, when we not started, but we did work through that ngeri last week that spoke about Parinini Hiki Waitotara, the emergence of the Sim Commission, which was technically a royal commission or an investigation into the wrongful doings of the Crown during 1860 when war broke out, and what else? And subsequent war beyond that point, So we spoke quite a bit about the context around the emergence of the Sim Commission and the way in which the Royal Commission investigated the wrongful doings at that time. So we thought this is probably a great idea would be a good idea to investigate a little bit more of the context. Maybe we've touched on this in a couple or one of our sessions in the past, but basically there's quite a bit of context around the activities of the time that led to quite a few historic reference points in our history. One of those being, obviously, which I touched on 18th of March 1860. Another key point in our history was the emergence and appointment of a king. And so this is a little bit of Taranaki's history around the context and the discussions and the kupu kōrero of the time that kind of led to 1860 and what led to the emergence of the kingitanga, and subsequently led to war. So we thought, yeah, I'm repeating myself, but we'll this is a little bit of the context. So there was a lot of land, not a lot, but there was a lot of demand for land from settlers post 1840. And so that naturally led to a lot of tension around access to land. And so what happened during that time, and I think we've touched on the sale of the mountain in past sessions as well, but what also happened during that time was the emergence of quite kind of deep debate and dialogue around what was Taranaki's, as a Taranaki iwi particular, and even Te Atiawa and other iwi in Taranaki, what was going to be the right approach for us as iwi to take to stem the flow of the sale of land, or agree to a process perhaps whereby rangatiratanga could be asserted and exerted through any future access arrangements to land. So that's kind of the context. And so what happened during that time was quite rigorous debates between ourselves and about what to do. So that kind of led to this time which we call or kurukuru, where people are, led to the time where people are figuratively putting in their po, like which we recently spoke about, which is basically putting in points in the land that became the basis for deep debate and dialogue about how they were going to address future land matters. If I can maybe just kick off with that, Jamie. You're on mute.
And this is really just an example of that. And, we won't go through all of it, but I think we'll just sort of point out to some key sort of references. So, ko o kurukuru te pau a tēnei iwi a Taranaki. So those of you that know, o kurukuru just south of Ormata of New Plymouth was a key point because, again, contested land, right? You had the Tatare Maka block and other things that had happened in that area, but that became that sort of point for Taranaki iwi, where anything sort of south of Kurukuru was not to be lost. So that's the Taranaki iwi sort of po. And then, we've got Kaiwi and Taipake, and maybe Mohi and Te Poihi will touch on Kaiwi and Taipake, which again were markers for Ngāti Ruanui and Ngā Rauru. But I think the key thing here is Ngā Taranaki po ka herea te wenua. And so there's a lot of these discussions, ka herea te wenua, ka herea te tangata. So, we hear about, te matinga o te wenua, te matinga o te tangata, but in this context, ka herea te wenua, ka herea te tangata. And one of the key leaders who was driving this particular dialogue, discussion, and this movement was Tāmati Wirumu Te Ngahuru, who was actually from Kurukuru. And so he was very much a part of this resistance on the basis that, his own hapu had felt the impacts of this sort of this land sale and policy. And so just jumping down, we see references ko ngā ware tūriai e ngā rangatira. And I love the way that our tupuna's minds worked. So they established what could be described as ceremonial houses, which became physical sort of manifestations of the oaths and the movement that, or this philosophy, I guess, right? Or this, this policy. This policy. So this policy that was adopted was embodied within houses or a particular action. So we have te kurupu, which we've talked about previously, being the ascent of the maunga, patu tūtahi in terms of that particular policy for Taranaki iwi. And then you had the establishment of houses. So patu tūtahi was one and then we have Taiporo Henui and Kumia Mai Te Waka. And the beautiful thing here is, ko te kaioroto I hēnei ware he pupuru wenua. And so that tells you what the purpose and philosophy of these houses are. And maybe if I kick over to Mohi and Te Poihi can sort of talk a bit about these particular names of Kumia Mai Te Waka and Taiporo Henui.
Mai we Te Poihi mo te rataha.
O tērā pēr ka kōrero mō Taiporo Henui, as we know in 1854, down in Manuapau, there was a whare built, and the whare was named Taiporo Henui by a matene Te Whiwhi, taku nei Mohio. There was a karanga to all the iwi to come together, just to have a bit of a wānanga around the acquisition of or selling, I suppose, of the land. And so that was the name of the whare nui, but it has some ancient kōrero or content that I believe the name Taiporo Henui derives from, in relation to kumara planting and whenua. But what I think it symbolises that the kumara and the planting of kumara requires whenua to flourish. So I think that it symbolises that theme of kia pupuru tonu I te whenua, kia tupu mato wai te tangata. And so it's got that theme around it, and it was used as a ingoa pou, or pou ingoa, for the establishment of course, in tangata tōmua whenua tōmuri. These were he kupu waka tumatuma, some defiance kupu around te pupuru or te whenua. So that's just a little bit of kōrero. Well, I've also, if you break it up, Taiporo Henui, some say that, the tai is the tides or the waves of the moana, ka poroporo haere, ka poroporo I ngā tai, just like the poroporo I ngā whenua, he nui tērā momo, no reira purutia mai rā te whare. Kia kore ai e rewa atu rā te whenua ki tai. So that's another sort of like a bit of an explanation around the kupu itself, my understanding for Taiporo Henui.
So I'm wondering if I just quickly put this into a kind of a linear reference. So if we look at 1840, we have the settlement of New Plymouth. By 1841, 42, 43, 44, 45, we get quite a bit of an extensive kind of bit of tension around access to land. Taranaki iwi, of course, and Te Atiawa become quite concerned about that, because the way in which land dealings were happening during that time were really quite serious. And so we have the sale of the Omata block. That leads to more tension. And Taranaki iwi basically say, well, look, enough is enough. Whakatūria te pau ko o kurukuru. We're putting our pau in the ground to say, e ro kurukuru, which is just on the New Plymouth side of Oakura. Katūria te pau ko o kurukuru. Mutu atu te hoko whenua I tēnei pau. So from here south, we're putting our pau in the ground called o kurukuru, and we're not agreeing to any more land sales. And that was sworn under a kind of an agreed policy.
Look, an oath.
An oath to not agree to any more land sales. And so that forum, that dialogue, that debate and that policy was then taken south to Ngāti Ruanui and Ngā Rauru. Ka tū ngā whare ko kumea mai te waka. Same kōrero. Me mutu te hoko I te whenua. Purutia te whenua I raro I tō mātou manawa. Ka tū anō te hui ki manawa pau. Taua kōrero anō ka Taiporo Henui. Me mutu, me tai, me poro rānei I ngā he nui o te hoko, te whenua, o te taimana, te Pākehā. E rā momo kōrero. Whakatūria ngā pau. Wakamutu atu te hoko I te whenua. Purutia I raro I te iwi. So I suppose that's kind of a quick overview of what was happening. And this is a great way in which which the old people kind of set that out. Ka o kurukuru te pau. Ko o kurukuru te pau in the north. Ko kai iwi, ko taipake in the south. Ngāti Ruanui, ngā Rauru. And Tamati, this old chap called Te Ngāhuru, was a key kind of instigator and a facilitator for that dialogue and discussion. and ka whakatūria ngā whare I hui hui ai aua kōrero me aua oati.
Yeah. And then the last pau there, te pau o te atiawa ko Waitaha. Ko Waitaha te ingoa o te awa I te taha o te taunga wakarererangi ni.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
In
so,
between Bell Block and the turn off to
Bell Block. Bell Block.
to the airport.
yeah. And so you basically had another pau from there. So from Waitaha north, that was Māori land as well. And so you had the designated area for tauiwi was between Waitaha and Okurukuru. And which were areas that had been transacted early on in the piece where most of the European settlement was. And then, so, hea te hua o e rā kōrero, and as Te Poihi said, I tai mai mā tēnei te wiwi ki te rā ui. And so we know the context in which mā tēnei te wiwi was involved when we start to focus in on that last paragraph there.
And that's another big piece of the context too, Jamie. That it seems like at that time, other communities and other rohe in this country were going through exactly the same challenges as what was happening here in New Plymouth, and of course in South Taranaki. So it seemed like there seemed to be a convergence of where the issues were happening, and they all came together at Manuapau and Taiporo Henui.
Te wā I kia taipake, and it's taku mo ki tērā, there's little that I can add to that other than the historical narratives that were handed down that when they opened that. So essentially, back when I was growing up, it was being used under the iwi groups of Ngāti Iti and Ngāti Pūkeko. But of recent times, has now been, you hear Tamarehe Roto, which is the matua of those two, been more to the fore nowadays, and which are pretty much championed very, very loudly by our whanaunga there, and everybody else is supporting that. But in the time of when they opened it, and some of the kōrero was opened by Kingi Koriki, but it was unofficially opened by him. The fact that he was traveling down by train, he was actually going to, I think it was down south, but on that way, there was two incidences that happened. The first one was at Waitotara, I reira te ka rongo, haramai ana te kingi. No reira, and if you're familiar with the marae there, there's a railway track that runs something like 500 meters from the marae. So they heard about him coming through, and then so they blocked the railway to get him to hop off and open up the meeting house there in Waitotara, which he did apparently. But the one I wanted to get to, which is around here at Taipake, and I don't know how they never had phones in those days, but the word got down there quickly while that had happened. So they I pērā oki rātou ka rongo. Te wā ka taupā aire I te ara tareina nei.
No.
Te ara tareina. And ki kore ai e haere. And I reira tonu me ngā rangatiro o Taiwawa, ka tonua, reiti me tonua, ka mea atu. Ka ara mai koe ki roto ia rauru o tino tērā wāhanga, ia tamere iti. Ana reiti me ko tūtu, engari, ko te koha kia mātou, ana tērā no te iware, kua tūngia, reiti me kua I tūwera Māori nei, engari, mo tēnei me te oai mana ka tonua aia, mana anō tērā hei ua ki te oa. So, in that time, so, he did. And te taipake, te ingoa taipake, nā tēte I kōrero ana, I auawa, tērā anō tēte, you'll see this kaiwi marae, which is just down a little bit from it. That marae there were kaotia mākura. Now, there were another iwi wanganui I hara mai rātou, And they normally used to go through a track from the Wanganui River, through a track, come over, cross over to Kaiwi, out to the sea. Along that journey there, word got out that they were building Kaotia Mākura, which is the marae in front of Kaiwi, but also with Taipake. So at the assistance of the iwi o Wawa, ka mea atu ki rātou e a o koutou koha kia mātou. So each time an iwi group will come through from Wanganui, they'd bring something from that side. Hei āwina ki te anga i te whare ki ka iwi, engari i whakaaro nui hoki ki Taipake. So there's those two incidences I can remember they were handed down from my memory. And of course, Taipake, you know, has been used a lot in our, what we say, tongi kōrero. Paranini keirunga, Taipake keiraro, or was it the other way around? Keirunga. Yeah. Moro, tēnā. The saying that's a gateway into Ngārauru, but also a gateway through into Ngārauru and Taranaki nui tone. So it's another one, I suppose, kupu rerenga kōrero that's quite famous today, that is used quite a bit with our people. Wea no koira taku iti mo tēnā wāi, unless you aputi anga a etei.
Kaore. Kaore, pēr ki te, go to the next slide. Agua mamake pēr tēnei te pānui, kua kōrero tonu rā. And so this is just another example of, and what I love about these, and we've said this all the time, you know, the way in which our tupuna were able to capture the depth of this history in a very concise manner, in itself is a wonderful skill, right? It's harder to write a short letter to the point than it is to write a long one. And, you know, our tupuna were masters of this.
And nui te kupu, iti te kōrero nui te kupu.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yes.
So kua ua pautonu, kua ua ware tūranga kōrero, ma taiporo he nui, kumea mai te waka. Me tērā kōrero, hinga katoa ha Ngāti Rūnui ha ngā rauru ki te kingitanga. Te putanga ko Waitara ka heke te toto Pākehā te toto Māori. And so I think the context here is really important, right?
I was going to ask that.
Yes. I see where you put that one in.
Well, but it's you know, I mean, you know, people talk about presentism, right? So, I mean, we will never truly understand the context, but certainly for me, me he mea ko te kaupapa, ko te tikanga I wāia aere te rātou, ko tēnei mea te ora. So, if, you know, if it was survival and they were seeking sort of prosperity and well-being for people, you would explore those avenues which you thought best provided you, you know, that. But, you know, this is at a time where, as Hemi described earlier, hei te riro te wenua. You know, Māori were looking for unity. You know, in Taiporo he nui, the hui at Manawa Pou in 1854 are all part of that, right? And the previous kōrero was really interesting because when you think about some of those iwi and the rangatira that were at Manawa Pou, like Mātene Te Wiwi, and, you know, and the karakia that he brought and the kōrero that he brought, you know, that all links back to the kingitanga movement. And we still talk about those things today. Hueno, he kōrero au him?
No, tika tonu. I think I ki te ara ko te kingi, ko ia tonu te ariki I pupuru mai ai tēnei mea te mana motuhake, mōrunga I te whenua, mōrunga te tangata. Ka kitea ko ka mate te whenua, ka mate te tangata, mehe mea ka riro ki te pū o te pakanga, ka riro ki te ringaringa o te Pākehā, ko te whenua. Mate nei te iwi Māori, ka kitea ko te kingi tonu, ko ia tonu tau te ariki. Māne pupuru mai tēnei mea te ora. Māne pupuru mai te whenua hei oranga mo te tangata. So the, you know, the kingship, I think a lot of people supported and continue to support the purpose for which and why the kingitanga was established, which was tēnei mea te pupuru I te ora mo te tangata, tēnei mea te hapai I te whenua.
And me
You know,
te
and
mea
we
nei,
can, sorry, Jamie.
me te mea nei roto I te kotahitanga ko te ora, ko te iwi, ne?
O te kotahitanga, ai.
O he huarahi anō kia whai oranga ai te tangata. So you know, just
And much
just another avenue.
And much like today, right? Like not everyone supports everything. And so we have pockets of different communities in different parts of this country that possibly, I don't know for sure, but don't share the same views. And so it's a little bit like back then, not everyone was a supporter. And so we have pockets of different whānau hapu with different views of the world.
Ko tētai atu e rua pē ngā tirohanga kai te whakarotia I au. Ka mea mai tātou te matu, te mauri pē o tēnei rerenga kōrero ana mo tēnei me te ora, tēnei mea hoki mo te mana anō ko kei te kite atu. I te mea whakaro anoa au tēnei me te hinga katoa ngā arua nui rauru ki te kingitanga. To me, that in another sense, it talks about ceded our sovereignty, so to speak, to the kingitanga.
Yeah.
And the consequence of that is, everything else that came after it, was because of that resulted from. I'm just thinking out loud here, because of our history, what's happened after that. So the way they used to hinga, I'm just wondering if that's a metaphorical understanding.
Yeah. I believe so. Because even in Taipora Henui, that the kingitanga was mooted at Taipora Henui in 1854 too. So it wasn't that they weren't, as we know, 1858, I think, that the kingitanga was sort of established as a forum. But I think, there was always a notion that, there were other avenues to try and find a survival, a pathway to survive.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, there are definitely examples and manuscripts that we've seen that set out that different pockets of our communities kāri heke ki te mana o te kingi. I pirangi nei rātou kia mau ki tō rātou ake mana motuhake ka mea atu rā ko taku hapu ko te kuri, ko te pōpokoriki, ko taku mana no roto tonu I te pēnua. Koira ka ki ai ko taku hapu, ko te pōpokoriki, ko te kuri.
Ko te matakātia te mani.
Ko te ngāhuru mā.
Te ngāhuru
Kāri pirangi kia eke ki raro ki te mana o tetehi atu.
Yeah.
Actually, e pai tēnā nā te mea ko I taua wāra ko te ngāhuru tēnā mea na, hei, kei a tātou tō tātou ake mana. He a koutou
And he lamented the fact that ka riro etehi ki te kingitanga, ko etehi kāri riro ki te kingitanga, ki te mana o tetehi atu, and we've become a little bit divided. So he lamented that fact that, kāri mau, ki tāna pēr I wawatai, au hoki, engari,
E nei roto I ngā tau I tērā wā me ngā wakatupuranga, kei reira tonu tērā toe I wainga nui I ngā wehenga o tēnā iwi o Taranaki ko hētahi. Ka riro ki te kingitanga ko ētahi atu ka ki ake, kei au ke he kingi ko tohu kākahi tō neingua. Ko ngā wehenga o ngā rauru tērā moi. Me ngā mea o te ngāhuru, kei au anō tōku mana kei te wenua e takoto ake nei. And, I guess we still, that's just the nature of community and human beings, eh?
Oh, absolutely. That's human nature, yeah.
Ana.
Right.
Yeah, and then I guess just some context here, because some of our Ngāti Tama, Ngāti Mutunga, sort of Ngāti Maru and our Ngā Rua Ine whānau are probably saying, where are we? Ka kapi katoa a Ngāti Tama, Ngāti Mutunga, a Ngāti Maru I tēnei karangatanga o Ngāti Awa. And ko Taranaki iwi ko Ngāti Ruanui, ko Ngā Rua Ine uki tēnā. tērā taha me te taha ki a Taranaki ui, ana
Yeah.
o ngā rauru.
Yeah.
And so with a lot of these references, you see, you know, Ngāti Awa Taranaki, or Te Ati Awa Taranaki, Ngāti Ruanui, ngā rauru, engari, you know, tērā karangatanga o Te Ati Awa Nui Tonu tēnā.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think if you think about the era and put it in context to how we think now, I mean, them, it's automatic understanding. When they speak for them, their whakapapa is all-reaching.
Yeah.
So, and it's probably demonstrated in this context, but perhaps tātou o tēnei reanga, we have to get, well, why aren't we in there? But again, this is an understanding, and the understanding historical narrative, the way they lived in those days, a hapu nei, a iwi nei. So it's all in context, eh?
Mm.
Yeah, that's a good point to highlight, actually, because I would suspect that a lot of our whānau will be trying to identify, so where do I fit into the picture? If, you know, if my iwi is not, you know, being demonstrated or in these
Ka mea
kōrero.
whakakarohi.
Yeah,
Whakakarohi.
yeah.
So I guess we go to the next slide, because I think that the next slide sort of ties things up quite nicely.
Oh,
Yeah.
oh.
So so you know, as we do when we go to big hui and have big debates and have big deep kōrero, we try and kind of wrap that up in some ceremonial kind of basis, yeah. And so what basically came out of the hui at Kumea mai te waka o kurukuru patu tūtahi and taiporo he nui were sacred oaths, or were oaths that were sanctified by karakia. And we've got history and evidence, and you guys will be familiar with that. And also kupu kōrero that came out, and many of us will be, our listeners tonight will be aware of some of these, and these kōrero that came out, and we call them oaths because they were sanctified by a ceremony, and actually enforced in many ways, enforced beyond that point. So they basically agreed to ko te tangata ki mua o te tangata tō mua, ko te whenua tō muri. They agreed to tangata kei mua no muri ko papa tuanuku. There's different ways that these oaths have emerged. Ko te tangata ki mua muri o ko te one, ko te ora te kupu oati o taiporo henui, which basically means people will be lost before we let go of the land, yeah? And the process for which they sanctified that was, which was told to me in a way that basically bound our physical being to the spirit of the environment, yeah. And ka huati atu tērā ki roto ki te reo Māori, ka mea tu he pataua no te rangi ka auti te hiri ki te whenua. Pene mea ko te ua he ke iho ana i te rangi, ka noho rā hei tohu here i te tangata i te whenua ki te rangi. Ne? Pene mea ko te auahi, he ke iho ana mai te papa ki te rangi, e here ana i te tangata mai te whenua ki te rangi, e here ana te rangi ki te whenua ki te tangata kai wānginui, koia tonu te mea here ana i tērā kupu oati. Anā ko te whakahuanga mai a te miringa ki au i roto i ngā tau, ka mea te ko patu tūtahi, ko te kurupū, ko taiporo henui, ka kumea mai te waka, ka mea te ko hau te pūtaketanga atu o te kōrero herenga whenua. Ka whiu atu te kupu oati ki te rangi, mā te atua here iho taua kupu oati. Te kupu herenga whenua, te kupu herenga tangata. Ana ka pērā te ahuatanga o tērā kupu oati.
Where?
E tino tapu.
Yeah. Pai tērā Hemi. Pai tērā.
Pai te whakamārama.
Kau ki ngā mahara ki tērā o tātou a te miringa. Yeah.
So, you know, the symbolism and imagery that first kupu wakawai at the top there for me is absolutely
Kare mei tu atu, eh? Kare mei tu atu.
Koreko. You know,
and the fact that kua hau te pūtaketanga o te kupu kōrero herenga whenua.
Whenua herenga tangata.
Ka whiua te kupu ki te rangi, te kupu oati, mā te atua e here iho. Taua kupu oati, herenga whenua. He pataua no te rangi, ka oti te hiri ki te whenua. He paua auahi no te whenua, ka oti te hiri ki te rangi.
Oh, te tāhua.
So profound.
So profound.
But ki te ātawa kāro tātou, you know, when you think about, because that's inspirational kōrero, right? You know, if you put yourself in the context of what was happening, you know, kei te noho tahi te iwi, and they're actually looking for, I mean, divine inspiration, right? You know, you need that strength and that inspiration from a higher. But you know what that speaks to for me? It's an affirmation of faith and belief.
Yeah. Ko ia tonu.
Because, you know,
And I also think that aligns with your earlier kōrero, Jamie, about knowing oneself as well and believing in oneself as well. This sort of consecrates or sanctifies that you know who you are as well, and you believe in what you do, and just stamping the envelope.
Yeah, so the imagery, you know, he pataua no te rangi, like the rain that falls from the sky, binds and seals me to this land. Like the smoke that emerges from our sacred fire and rises to the sky, binds and seals me to the sky.
Yeah.
So there's this binary or this piece about us being in the middle and sealing this oath between I say heaven and earth, for want of a better term.
But I think it also talks about there's nothing linear in the way our people thought.
No.
It was, you know?
You tika tau.
Me te mea nei, wakahuatia anō tērā kōrero ko au te pūtaketanga o te herenga kia rongo mai te iwi nā te mea he rawe tērā kōrero mo te iwi.
Well, ka mea te kua hau te pūtaketanga o te kua hau te pūtaketanga atu o te kupunga here whenua. Ka whiua atu te kupu ki te rangi, te kupu oati, mā te atua e here iho taua kupu. Ko taua oati, he oati herenga whenua. He pataua no te rangi ka oti te hiri ki te whenua. He paua auahi no te whenua ka oti te hiri ki te rangi.
Anybody doing your masters or your doctorate out there, you got it right there. Kāre he kupu tua tui e nei o ngā kōrero.
Well, and we saw that, you know, this is a ceremony that's sanctified by karakia, by the swearing of oaths, by other kinds of ceremonial means. So you can see why in 1858, when we have particular parts of our Taranaki communities wanting to sell land, when we've committed to this oath of te tangata tō mua, te whenua tō muri, you can kind of get a sense of how serious that was in terms of the transgression, perhaps, of this oath.
Yeah. And then I think the other context to remember is there was a fear of loss of mana, quite apart from the physical elements of the land. Yeah. The other elements here was that, you know, foreign law, foreign ways were having an impact on our people's way of life and way of being.
Yeah.
And so I just sort of wonder, you know, like just if we think about this kōrero in today's context, how might our whānau utilise this kōrero wakawai? Because I think, you know, despite its historical sort of context, in terms of how, you know, mohi given what Hemi's just articulated to us all, mehe mea ka whakamahia e koe te kupu kōrero nei he pataua no te rangi he nei rangi. What might be some examples of how you might use it in a contemporary context?
I think I would. The thing about the, you know, so if you consider the challenges they were going through in their time, and these things would come about through those challenges, which not force them, but these things were created out of that type of environment. Therefore, today I'll use the most easy one I can think of. It would be the COVID situation, not the COVID, but what it's done to us as the people. And then and through that we've got the pros and cons. We got we got all that sort of. I'm not making comment on that. I'm talking about the challenges that we have about us. So, ara te pata no te ua, hei eke mai ke auna, he a te pawa ua, hei no te whenua. In the context of that we're in today. And I'm just thinking about that now as I'm talking. I'm just actually not making it up. I'm just thinking about the challenges we got now. And where's the relevance of this right now? And the most obvious challenge we got right in front of us right now. So, hei te waihanga tonu, pe a koutou.
Ka pai. Te Poihi.
Well, I'm just thinking about your commitment to or being loyal to a particular kaupapa. So whatever that is that, to be confident in. So say if, we do a lot of karakia, so if the mātauranga, rapuhaere ngā mātauranga, rapuhaere ngā wakamarama o ngā kōrero o nehe, find, so I think it's about being committed to a particular kaupapa, whether it be a challenge kaupapa, like the COVID, or whether it be something like, kia ako tō tātou nei reo. Find some kind of bearings where this can bind your commitment to learning the language. So I think it can be applied to something as simple as that. So that's how I kind of koe nā taku tirohanga ki tēnei momo rerenga kōrero.
Him.
Oh, I think you raised it before, Jamie. Tēnei mea te wakapono. Faith, and that's for me individually and personally, perhaps. But there's this thing about the importance of ceremony and the way in which we conduct our ceremony too. Tēnei mea te tuku te paua auahi ki te rangi. Through the process of an oath or a commitment that we might make as an iwi or as a whānau, tahuna te ahi. Tukuna atu te paua auahi ki runga ki te whenua. Kia oti tō kupu oati.
Kia rangi nui, rangi roa, rangi. Tā ua
rangi.
Tā ua nuku, tā ua rangi. So you can have like two in your heading.
Ma te atua noa here taua kupu.
E me te ānei o ki au nei, he pata ua no te rangi, puta atu ki waho kia rongo koe i te ua.
Me ona kōrero.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, you heard it from me. I mean, this speaks to our belief in our faith, in our ways of being and knowing. Right? It's it's got to be one of the, and that kupu kōrero that Te Miringa would always recount. Hemi is probably one of my favorite.
Kua hau te pūtaketanga o te kupu heringa. Kua hau te pūtaketanga o te oati.
And yet, ko te mea pai ki au is that, ultimately, it's taking personal responsibility. Because we can find all sorts of excuses. Engari, kua au te pūtaketanga o te oati, whenua heringa tangata o tēnei mea te kime I te ora.
And it just reminds me of the wakawai da kua o ki te taupā ki hae bua wai oku moi moi ia. It's got that type of theme that you are your own obstacle, I suppose. You are your own barrier to come to fruition.
That must have been a pretty significant time, because there's other kōrero that talk about ka whakairia te hinu tapu ki runga ki ngā whata.
That's right. Yep.
So that must have sanctified in some way their tribal structures that, these are pretty heavy and pretty heartfelt ceremonies.
So would you think though then they also came from a time with the paipera tapu ka umai hoki taua wā. So there's concepts in there. I heard you say about the hinu tapu. So I'm thinking about this thing about being an anointed disciple or
Yeah.
follower, believer
Yeah.
of something.
Yeah.
Ai pia.
But you know, ko te mea kia au, it reminds us of our responsibilities, the importance of ceremony, as you've said, Hem, and to continue to perform those things, right? Because by doing that, it makes us who we are. You know, whether that ceremony or whether it be that fact that actually feel the rain falling, you know, I ki mai nei ngā mātua, ngā kuia I te kāinga I uranui. You know, if you can get wet in the rain, ko te ora koe, mehe mea kei te rongo koe I te ngau o te makariri kua rongo koe, ko te ora
Te
koe.
ora. Kua rongo koe te ora.
Kua rongo koe te ora. Mehe mea kei te, ki te rongo koe te ngau o te makariri.
Se tērā no, hangarite ana ki tērā, you know, o tātou o naunga o Wangani, ka e kōrero mo te awa, me kōrero ki te awa. Ara mai a rauri me te ki atu, tērā no, e te iwa ka kōrero te awa ki a koe.
Me rongo.
So, that's to own that. To own that, you obviously the most obvious thing I would say, you need to believe in that. You got to have the faith in that. Hey,
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Mo tēnei āhua.
Yeah, the way aro o te tangata.
Yeah.
I think that brings us brings us to a close, I think. But you know, paingi nei o ngā kōrero hei whakarongotanga mā te katoa. Mihi ka wake rā ki koutou anō. So those who are still watching, kia kaha, kia maia. And I assume that you would have got something out of tonight's kōrero. So any last words from the Pai Tūranga kōrero?
Nai tira.
I know they spoke enough by the... Oh, moi.
Hei konei.
Ai, tino tohu tērā, no reira, mihi ana ki tātou tohua tupua nuku, tohua tupua rangirangi Aotearoa papahaha ro aupiki autu aurongo marairoa. E rongo he wakari a ki runga tūturu, waka mabu kia tīna.
Tīna.
Uie.
Tai ki.
Pō Mārie.